What is the most psychologically messed up book? Story 1. It might sound cliche, but you should actually read 1984. A lot of people think they understand this book without reading it, but the experience of going through it is singularly depressing. It is a soul crushing story that was so bleak I felt dread every time I picked it up. It seems to radiate misery from every page. There's a reason it's considered a classic, and it's not just for the comparisons with police states and totalitarianism. It's an amazingly well realized vision of hell. First time I read it, I got to the end about midnight and felt so bleak afterwards that I stayed up another 5 to 6 hours just so I could watch the sunrise the next day. Though I've got to say, Brave New World always seemed a more hopeless situation. There are cracks in the 1984 regime, even if they're minuscule. It's why there is a Room 101 in the first place. On the other hand, almost everybody in Brave New World actively enjoys being part of their society. The people are in love with their dystopia, so it seems likely to last forever. Story 2. The Long Walk, Stephen King. Teenage me did not like that set of mental images at all. And for an already deeply anxious kid, it was nightmare fuel. Walk the right way or get shot. In seventh grade, I had an assignment: check out a random book from the school library and write a book report on your selection. Instead, as I pulled The Long Walk from my dad's bookshelf, I thought, what does it matter if it comes from the school library? It mattered. I mean, The Long Walk was readily available to me in my middle school library, as were several King works. I started reading him in middle school, actually. The Dark Tower was an obsession in my friend group, and we'd talk in Gileadian cant. Story 3. Lolita. It delves into the mind of a predator and their victim mentality. It's also terrifying how many people miss the point. Intentionally exposing yourself to troubling or disturbing topics, when you are in a safe space and able to deal with the emotions they bring up, is a good way to practice dealing with difficult emotions. Disturbing and troubling things are certainly going to happen to everyone in life. I think it's better to have had some practice dealing with things like this in a productive manner beforehand. It can make you more emotionally strong. Story 4. The Road by Cormac McCarthy messed me up a little. I'm not game enough to watch the movie. To this day, I've not finished it. Finally, they made it to the beach. McCarthy makes you feel the accomplishment, the sense of peace, the joy. But we've been on this journey. This is not how it ends. There are too many pages left in the book for there to be a happy ending. Actually, McCarthy, I'll just stop right here. Not turning another page. This book has a happy ending, damn it, because I choose to go no further. The spine of the road stares at me from my bookshelf, taunting me. Just a few more pages. Nope. Just nope. Story 5. American Psycho is brutal. I had to put it down. I've never finished it. I've tried to read it a few times and just gave up. I got probably halfway through an audiobook while I was working, but some parts are just so messed up I felt weird listening to it on headphones around my coworkers. It just felt like listening to a narration of a snuff film. Particularly, all of the violence against dogs got to me. I eventually decided I'm not that curious to how the book ends and gave up on it once again. Congrats, Bret Easton Ellis. You've made the most profoundly repulsive crap probably ever written. If there's anything more messed up than American Psycho, which I'm sure there is, I am entirely uninterested in it. Story 6. A Child Called It. I remember when I was in what I think was my final year of elementary school. Our English teacher read this to us as a class, a bit at a time each day. She even warned us of its contents, and that it contained harsh language that she would not cover up, since she felt that everything in the book should be read as is. I still remember when she read one of the parts where his mom calls him a little piece of crap. Hearing one of my teachers, especially an older woman in her 50s or 60s, she put so much emotion into it while reading, she really did not hold back portraying the people. That experience really stuck with me, as did the book. I still haven't read it myself. After hearing it, I'm worried that I'll start crying while reading. Story 7. There's a bunch of young adult books that shaped my childhood. And I think about my outlook on the world. I looked them up and they're all by the same dude, Robert Swindells. He's a very decorated author, not because his books are particularly well-written IMO, but because he kept writing bleak dystopian bullcrap. And that seemed to be what good children's literature was about back then for some reason. If the theme of the 1970s was get attached to this kid's friend or dog or deer or kestrel so I can end them, because you have to learn about death, the 80s was humans suck and you can't do crap about that, so don't bother. If you wanted an award in the 80s and 90s, Now, you wrote about jerks being jerks to other jerks, while nuclear war tears the planet. It poisoned much of the young adult category for 20 some years, and my formative, malleable, cortisol soaked sidbrain. F. U. Robert. Story 8. There was a book a few years ago called The Flame Alphabet that had a very fascinating premise. Sound produced by children causes physical pain, illness, and even death in adults. The whole world is transformed by this mysterious happening. The premise made me pick up the book immediately. Where the disturbing part came in was that a few chapters into the book, the novel takes this completely bizarre twist. Apparently, many of the characters are secretly forest Jews, and they sneak off to hidden sheds in the woods, and they place a half-organic, half-electronic, gelatinous membrane over a hole in the ground and receive incomprehensible sermons that can only be heard through the hole. It went from dystopian novel with interesting premise to what in the ever-loving crap really quickly. I don't know that it is disturbing in the traditional sense, but the remainder of the book had this completely out-of-place shadow hanging over it of this utterly bizarre plot device. Story 9. Bridge to Terabithia. There are maybe other worse books out there. I think I saw The Wasp Factory, and Ian Banks is excellent at the really messed up, but those are aimed at adults. Bridge to Terabithia targeted me as a lonely, isolated child. I read it when I was 11 and alone, and it gave me hope and then told me, nope, that'll go to crap too. So for you and anyone else who catches this, Patterson wrote the book because her son had a friend who was struck by lightning and ended. She saw her son having a difficult time with it and wrote the book to help other children learn about death and coping. Jess even goes through the stages of grief in the story. It's a very rough read for a 10 or 11-year-old, but it's also a perfect read because it lets the reader deal with death and loss without, hopefully, having to deal with actual hope and loss. Story 10. House of Leaves. I was a horribly pretentious teenager, educated in Scotland. In my final year of high school, I took a qualification called Advanced Higher. Final grade was based 50% on an exam, 50% on a 6K word essay of original research on 2 texts. I chose to discuss the use of formatting as a literary device in House of Leaves and the electric Kool-Aid acid test. My teacher had to read both to be able to grade me. I was not popular. Story 11, since no one said it, The Giving Tree. This book is ideologically incomprehensible, and it's read to children. It's about a tree that keeps giving of itself until there's nothing left. Then the book just ends. The recipient of this toxic relationship learns nothing and keeps coming back for more. It speaks to a really disgusting element of the human condition, but somehow kind of says nothing about it and just leaves readers depressed. Totally agree. I hate this book. It's like Treebeard. Instead of getting ready to kick the crap out of some orcs, instead stood there and slowly self-harmed himself to death while dropping random loot for Pip. The tree was happy. Foff, no, it wasn't. I think this is how I decided unconditional love is creepy and weird and should not be encouraged. I was Team Tree like most readers, but I also thought the tree was kind of infuriating for not being the kid with a branch or just dumping a crapload of apples straight on his head. Ungrateful little crap. Story 12. Jack Welch's self-style jack-off book, Jack Straight from the Gut. A book written by the man who truly pioneered 21st century Western capitalism creative bookkeeping, middle management structuring, CEO profiteering, short-term profit-orientated result, mass layoffs and rehiring, stock buyback schemes, company shell games, offshoring workforces, designed obsolescence, and basically every horrific thing that we all hate businesses for doing today. The man was basically ground zero for every practice that would appeal to every CEO of a major company ever since, and turned the workplace into a place where you could have one person work one job with one company that cared for them and their family, to the mess we have today. And he wrote a book about himself and how genius he was to do it all. Or save yourself the book and go listen to Behind the Bastards, two-partner on him. Story 13. Dianetics. Literally the only book I've ever thrown across the room. Way back in the 80s, a friend bet me $5 that I wouldn't be able to read it. I took him on and read that garbage. My breaking point was when it said the reason people had eating disorders was when they were in the womb. Their mom said something about being fat because, of course, a fetus understands spoken language. I whipped that book as hard as I could. My friend was amazed I got that far and actually paid out the $5. He didn't ask for the book back either. Story 14. Exquisite Corpse by Poppy Zebright. Surprised at the lack of extreme horror in this thread, but if there is one book that defines that genre and goes beyond the pointless, grotesque nature of the genre, it's this one. It's simultaneously the most beautiful and most horrific thing I've ever read. It made me feel so dirty, but it's been stuck in my brain ever since I read it. Story 15. There's lots of great books. I'll throw in one I haven't seen mentioned. The Metamorphosis of the Prime Intellect. Think I have no mouth, yet I must scream. Only the AI isn't fueled by hate, but by its desire to provide humans with a utopia. It creates a physical space that reminds me of the Oasis from Ready Player One. People each have their own worlds, which they can have anything they want. They can alter their physical bodies to whatever they desire. But this enforced bliss becomes a sort of prison for our protagonist, who rejects every comfort, opting for her world to be devoid of everything, even direction. The only pleasure she feels is by going to be abused by masochists, would-be serial executioners, which she achieves by entering a contract in which the prime intellect will ignore her physical distress for a set amount of time before reintegration and returning her body back to health. There's a lot more to the plot, but that's how it starts, and it's available to read for free. Story 16. Hogg by Samuel R. Delany. Years ago, I was heavily interested in reading a bunch of books of different genres. I couldn't afford to buy a majority of these books, so I turned to torrenting ebooks. I wanted to try and read some darker material, and a book that piqued my interest was Hogg. I heavily regret reading it as it was one of the most messed up books I've ever read. The main character, who's a boy who is the narrator of the story, is sold into slavery to a very evil man named Hogg. Hogg regularly assaulting this boy sold to him and assaulting women and men throughout the book, he and his companions make a living ruining people's lives that they come across and they gain satisfaction from assaulting them. You, as the reader, will regularly wish death upon these characters for their crimes they commit throughout the book. I couldn't believe something like this was allowed to be published. I was disgusted by the whole thing, but became very invested in finding out if Hogg gets what is coming to him. Well, I won't spoil her. What happens in case you want to read sick crap like this? But I regret reading this book years late. Story 17, A Thousand Splendid Suns. Although it ends on a positive note, the experiences that Miriam and Layla endured are undeniably disturbing, and the book does not shy away from the trauma and oppression they faced during their marriage to Rashid. It may very well be one of the most important reads emo. As a woman, it makes me appreciate all the freedoms I grew up with that so many others in the world were deprived of during, and sadly, continue to be in many parts of the world today. Story 18, The Hot Zone. It's about Ebola and the history of it, including its predecessor, Marburg virus. The detail it goes into is brutal. It doesn't read too much like a non-fiction book, which makes it a good read. But for me, reading it in high school over a decade ago was rough. A detailed account of someone barfing and pooping, plus out their now liquefied organs and muscles, is definitely something. Despite that, 10 out of 10 would be recommended. Especially now, I think there's a vaccine that I need to get despite living nowhere near Africa. Also, The Demon in the Freezer, same author. Less viscerally scary, but incredibly interesting. It's about smallpox and how most big nations responded to the eradication of the disease in terms of what they did with their stock of smallpox vials that they had used to research. Poses such an interesting question. Is a disease really eradicated if there are vials of it in vaults? Should we keep some just in case it resurfaces in the wild somehow? And we need to make vaccines or medicine again? Or should we just get rid of it all completely and make sure it's wiped off the face of the earth? Can you guarantee that everyone has actually done this? Or do you think some countries might not be able to overlook the massive wartime advantage of being the only nation with access to weaponized smallpox? I highly recommend it. Story 19. Tender as the Flesh is rough. The ending is like a physical punch to the gut. I think I actually reeled back in disgust. Fun story, I left that over at my parents' house as I was reading it during a visit. My 76-year-old mom picked it up. I warned her, but I think that made her want to try it more. She's always been pretty edgy. She called me at like 3:30 a.m. when she finished it and said, "Holy crap, what is wrong with you? I'm not going back to sleep tonight, Jesus." It was great. Also, shout out to Lolita, which is absolutely the best written worst book in the world. That man is a genius, and his writing is amazing. That book is straight awful, but wow, is it ever well composed. Story 20, The Jungle, Upton Sinclair. A book that lived in my head for years. I remembered learning about the revolution that it caused, but never actually read it in school. I finally listened to the audiobook at work, and I couldn't count the times it made a fully grown man cry. I had to get up and dip out of the side door BC. There are just so many tragedies in the book. You really understand the experience of being an immigrant worker in the US in the 1920s. Absolutely brutal story. I highly recommend it. Story 21, Island of the Blue Dolphin. Just awful. I had to read it in elementary school, and I'll never forget it. For those who are blessed not to have this on your curriculum, it's about a native girl who's stranded on an island with her little brother while the rest of the tribe leaves on a boat. Her brother is eaten by wild dogs the first, and she spends the next 30 years alone and slowly going crazy until she is rescued by the British. We read this at age 10. Yippee. Story 22. Misery. Stephen King. 30 or so years ago now, but I've never forgotten getting to the hobbling scene in the book. The movie scene was way more tame than the book. As I was reading, the slow realization of what was about to unfold had me throw the book across the room. An assay lab in a gold mine in Western Australia. I can't recall how long it took before I worked up the courage to pick up the book again. The thing about books is you're the director of the movie unfolding in your mind. Story 23, A Little Life. Came here to find this. I brought this as I love long epics, but didn't read any reviews or warnings. I couldn't finish it in the end. It just became so unrelentingly bleak for June that I couldn't continue. I was surprised to see they turned it into a stage play, which I haven't seen, but I am intrigued as to how they could make it work for the stage. Yep, read it a few years back. Absolutely devastating. A couple months ago, my brother's girlfriend was looking for a book recommendation, and I offhandedly recommended A Little Life because I remembered it being a beautiful story. It is, of course. I warned her that it was sad, but worth the read. 2 weeks later, I got a call from my brother, who was furious. Apparently, his girlfriend had made it about halfway through the book before collapsing into uncontrollable sobbing and locking herself in their room. So, yeah, sad book. One of the only books I know where I've heard from multiple people that they were physically unable to finish it because of the emotional toll. Still, a beautiful story. Story 24, Gulag Archipelago, absolutely harrowing in every sense. Otherwise, Catcher in the Rye sucked. Grapes of Wrath has a disturbing ending, and Mein Kampf is maniacal. Catcher in the Rye. Holden is actually mentally ill and is committed to a mental hospital as he tells his story. He says so only on the first and last pages. Holden tells us this in plain English, but most students seem to miss this because the story gets rolling right away. Now, go reread it, knowing that it was narrated by someone who has lost his grip on reality and is undergoing hospitalization for it. Holden is the ultimate unreliable narrator. You are not a book reader. He is in a depressive fugue state, and you are his therapist. We are introduced to this concept at age 14 to prepare us for life where most of the people we encounter are also unreliable narrators. Whether that be people in your personal life, the screaming, judgmental crap birds on TV news, the scumbags in the halls of Congress, or even the people posting here on Reddit. It's a life preparation book. Even the title of the book is a lie. There is no Catcher in the Rye, but was Holden an unreliable narrator at all? The book is brilliant because it works to point out that readers are unreliable too. He told you all what was happening and you missed it. Story 25. Not a book, but I once read an account of the Iran-Iraq War on either r/military or r/USMC. A global war on terror vet recounted a story his unit's interpreter, who was a veteran of the Iran-Iraq War, told him. I'll paraphrase it because it was years ago, but the interpreter recounted that the Iranians would recruit war orphans as child soldiers and send them towards their Iraqi trench lines, wearing vests in human wave attacks. The prevailing thought at the time was that the Iraqis would hesitate to shoot them. In the aftermath, they would often find little hands clutching metal or plastic keys. They would often find notes saying things like, "This is your key to heaven. No matter what, don't let go." That one stuck with me. Messed with me a bit too, and I'm used to seeing the depths of human depravity abroad. There are some true monsters out there. That war was notable for some of its battles, like ones out of World War I, opposing trench lines close to each other and separated by a no man's land, in battles where human wave attacks were commonly used. Story 26, Gulag Archipelago. During its time, it was one of the most famous books and is credited with not only being the most effective means of telling the world the horrors of the Soviet Union and its concentration camps, but by some accounts was crucial to the eventual collapse of it. The writer Alexander Solzhenitsyn was assigned 10 years of hard labor in the Gulag for a remark about Stalin in a letter sent home during the war. It was very common for soldiers returning from war to be thrown in camps for a 10 or 15 or 20-year sentence. The book is full of these stories and how a society can completely turn on itself with the wrong ideology, the ideology in this case being Marxism. The problem outlined was that when you break down society completely based on only the oppressed and oppressor groups, everyone is either a perpetrator or a victim. The major issue with what happened in the Soviet Union is that the most competent people in their society were the first to be turned in for their crimes against the people. The best farmers were thrown in the camps. Husbands turned on wives and wives on husbands. Eventually, everyone is guilty. And the writer, instead of having his book just be an expose on socioeconomic theory, used his time in the camps to go through every part of their society that allowed this all to happen. I think most people could give you a breakdown of old Germany, but I haven't met many people who have any idea that upwards of 20 million people died as a result of the gulags. The true terrifying part to me is that it's their own people they did it to. We could learn a lot about ourselves reading that book.